It's autumn of 1989, and I'm in the parking lot of the school we went to in fourth grade. It's this Presbyterian school we went to for a couple of years. It's very religious. And I'm in the parking lot with my best friend by default, Kent. And I say best friend by default because we didn't have a great deal in common, and we didn't particularly like each other. We were best friends because his best friend had had moved away, and I had just come to this school, so I didn't have a best friend, which you can't be that person, especially if you're a boy. So we kind of glommed onto each other, and we would have play dates from time to time, as boys do. My mom would come and pick us up from Kent's house, and that was something that she hated doing. My mom was a wonderful, supportive person who did not care for, and I'm trying to leave off last names because I know that's the thing you're not really supposed to do in storytelling, and whatever. Kent's mom, they were a very, very, very religious family, to the point where their Sunday was the entire weekend. His mom was like a 1950s cartoon character. I would regularly see her flitting about the house in a dress and pearls and full makeup with a feather duster. And that is not a thing that should be real. My mom was a first-degree black belt novelist, crime reporter for our local paper. She was rough, and tumble. The two of them only got along like Kent and I because they were the parents of friends by convenience. And Kent's mom only liked to talk about, at least according to my mom's exaggeration of their conversations, she only wanted to talk about the Bible. That was apparently the only thing that's ever been written. So every conversation was about how great that Bible is. And my mom, in the intervening years, as I've talked with my dad more and more about her as a person, I've learned that she was a religious person, but nobody can take that much time talking about the Bible. So it is to her credit that she let me hang out at their house and play Legos with their son. In the parking lot, in this particular moment, I have my backpack slung over my shoulder, and in it are all of the books for school, all of this knowledge. And in my other hand, I've got this canvas bag. And this canvas bag is my favorite thing in the world. It's a 1988 Lego airport set. I love my 1988 Lego airport set. I'd gotten it that Christmas, and I'd seen it in the stores, and I pored over it, and miracle upon miracle, Santa Claus, my parents' Claus, had gotten this for me, and that was one of the best Christmases, opening up this 1988 Lego airport set and putting it together the entire Christmas day, and the half buildings and the two airplanes, the jumbo jet and the puddle jumper, and like the clear cut pieces I'd never seen before, and it was a brand new type of piece. And the next morning, the day after Christmas, something terrible had happened. My parents had thrown out the instructions on how to make the 1988 Lego airport set along with the wrapping paper. And this is before the internet was around, so I could never take it apart. So for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, I kept this thing in pristine condition in the living room, or the dining room rather, of my childhood home in the corner. No one was allowed to touch it. I kept the German Shepherds away from it. And going over to Kent's to play Legos, I wanted this thing with me, but I was being very, very careful about it. Now, my books were very, very heavy in the backpack and getting heavier because this knowledge was really stupid and I didn't really want it. I just wanted this 1988 Lego airport set. But I was struggling with it. And Kent offered to carry, not the books. Why would he want the books? He wanted to carry the Lego airport set. And he kept saying, Morgan, let me just carry it. Let me carry it. Let me lighten your load. I'm like, no, you're going to break it. I'm not going to break it. You're going to break it. I'm not going to break it. I promise. All right. Just be careful. Oh, you just want me to be careful? Just be careful. Oh, okay. I'll be careful. And he starts gently swinging it around a bit and swinging it more and more. I'm like, Kent, just be careful. Just be careful. And he hits the ground. And I heard that sickening sound that you only hear when the 1988 Lego airport set cracks. Let's fast forward a bit to April of 2009. In April 2009, I'm standing in the driveway of my childhood home with my dad. And my sister is in the car with her best friend, and my sister isn't really talking. My dad and I are waiting for a van to arrive, and a white van pulls into the driveway. and it says on the side in rust-colored burgundy lettering, "Aftermath Crime Scene Cleaners." Two middle-aged gentlemen step out of the van, and they're very respectful, and they speak in that sort of non-committal tone of people who are used to dealing with tragedy, saying things like, "Show us where the event took place, what needs to be taken care of," those sort of things. My dad and I lead the two men into my childhood house in upstate Connecticut. The police tape has been severed. The police have long since left the scene, and the investigation is at a close. So we're allowed to enter. The first thing we do is we lead them into the television room. This is where I played with a lot of my Lego sets, and in the TV room on the floor is a large red bloodstain. That's where Dante, one of the two German Shepherds, was shot and killed. There's a opaque plastic sheeting over the door that we part as a curtain to lead them in, and we say, well, this is what needs to be taken care of. And we'll show you the other location. We lead them through the living room, past my mom's antique furniture that she had collected over the years, marred by cat scratches and puppy teething, and we lead them into the dining room. And the dining room is where we had our Christmas tree set up. This is where Christmas Day took place every year. This is where I'd gotten my favorite Lego set. And there's another large bloodstain on the floor. This is where the other German Shepherd was killed. I don't remember the name of this German Shepherd because this one my mom had gotten after I had gone off to grad school. There's also a vase that was broken nearby, and that was because my mom had shot and killed both of these dogs. She'd done it in two different rooms so that one dog wouldn't know what's happening to the other. An autopsy on my mom would reveal that she had Parkinson's and Parkinson's dementia at the time, and because of this, she wasn't a clean shot. So the vase was broken because the second dog took a while to die. According to the police reports, what happened next was, after shooting and killing both of these dogs, she then called the police. She said, I've just shot and killed both of my dogs, and I'm going to kill myself. She then went outside to the park bench that we had next to the stream, and she put the gun in her mouth, and she pulled the trigger. Now, there's a piece of medical trivia that I desperately wish I didn't know, and that is it's possible to survive a gunshot at point-blank range in that fashion, provided that the angle of the gun is high enough and that it misses the brain, or the brain stem rather, and that first responders arrive at the scene fast enough to stabilize the victim. My mom had waited until she had heard a police car pull into the driveway and the sound of the doors close before she pulled the trigger. She lived for an additional 12 hours, which is how we found her. I received the phone call from my sister. I was in grad school in Vermont, and I was eating canned Indian food with my girlfriend, Jen, when my sister called up. The first time she called up, she was worried because no one was answering the phone and the answering machine had been switched off. The second time she called up in a panic because the police had contacted her. And the way they'd contacted her was my sister was still living in our childhood town in upstate Connecticut, and the police had recognized her car, and they flagged her down and told her what had happened on the side of the road. So my sister called me in a panic. We didn't have all the details. She had just been told that my mom had attempted suicide. We met at the hospital. This was St. Francis Hospital in Connecticut. I drove down in record time. In fact, I got pulled over at one point by the police, and the police officer walked over to my window with the flashlight ready to give me the, "Do you know how fast you're going?" And before he got the first two words out of his mouth, I blurted out, "My mother has just shot herself, and I'm told she has hours to live. I'm going to St. Francis now." And he stumbled for a second with his words and said, I'm very sorry. Go on your way. Just try to keep it under the speed limit." And I said, "Yes, officer," and then I floored it. When I got to St. Francis, again, I hadn't been told exactly how bad things were, but in the periodic cell phone calls I'd been making back and forth in the car, my dad had told me that everyone was going in to say goodbye to my mom. When I got there, I asked the orderly on duty how bad it was, and he said the bluntest sentence that I've ever heard. I asked if she would come out of the coma that she was in, and he said, "Her brains are sticking out of the back of her head." The answer is no. It's not easy to tell how bad an injury is to a person in a hospital. That was one of the things I'd never prepared myself for, because a person is prepared a certain way. In my mom's case, she had a blue foam headpiece around her head that was taped into position, so you couldn't see around her head. I couldn't see how bad it was. I could tell that something very traumatic had happened. Both of her eyes looked like they'd been punched, presuming that was from the gunshot itself. Her right hand was in an evidence bag. We stayed at my mother's side for an additional 8 hours. Now, the other bit of trivia that I know, which I wish I didn't, is that it's very rarely how you see it in TV and movies, where a person passes away with great flair and drama. There isn't a machine that makes beeping sounds and then flatlines. At least in the case of situations like my mom, she was being kept alive by so many different machines. Each one's making different sort of sounds, beeps and whirs and whatnot. And she was also being kept alive by a respirator that was causing her chest to rise and fall. So the moment that she passed away, we all missed. We were all in the room with her, and I think I was looking out the window at the time. My dad was probably looking at his phone. My sister maybe pacing back and forth, and it took the nurse on duty to come in and say that Mrs. Pielli has passed for us to realize that, oh, she's died. The aftermath of what happened to her, we all dealt with differently, and I can't speak to their experiences. That's their story. For me, one of the first things I did was I sought out survivors of suicide support group. And there was fortunately one in the area, and I started seeing a therapist as well. One of the things that I learned going to the Survivors of Suicide support group was that it wasn't really for me. And the reason for this was that, and I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing how other people grieve, but it seemed to me that a lot of the people there were going there to relive their experiences, that they were picking at a scab that they would never really let heal. There's also an unfortunate dynamic within the group, which is that the majority of the people there were older than me, and they had lost people my age. It was mostly parents who'd lost children. So there was this strange dynamic of me being the age of their children, and that was hard for, I think, everyone. But one thing that they said, and that my therapist reiterated, was that suicide in a family is very difficult on family and on relationships. Marriages tend to break apart. Spouses leave each other. Girlfriends, boyfriends tend to break up. And I thought, that's ridiculous. Jen and I are a match made in heaven. We've been together for 3 glorious months. This is going to go fine. We will weather this. We've just moved in together, which was the best decision possible. Cracks started to form nearly immediately. I'm sure I wasn't the easiest person to be with, and I cannot imagine what it was like for her to be dating someone who was the mess that I was. At the time, I started having what I like to call rolling panic attacks. And what a rolling panic attack is, it's a term that I made up. It is when you have a panic attack, and as that panic attack starts to go away, there is another panic attack just waiting right behind it. And you're just never lonely when you have rolling panic attacks. They put me initially on Valium because it was getting so bad that my heart was just racing and I'd be up at all hours, tossing and turning or just walking around the apartment. So they put me on Valium to kind of like settle me a bit. Then they switched me to a combination of antidepressants and antipsychotics. That was a fun thing to learn that I was on. And then the third thing they put me on was they put me on jogging. Now, I suspect part of this was because my grad degree was in cartooning, which is a ridiculous sentence. I was going to a cartooning school, which is a ridiculous thing to exist. So I probably looked like garbage just under a normal condition. So I'm sure they just thought I needed exercise, but also it was a good way to work out all this built-up anxiety that I was feeling. One of the reasons why relationships tend to fall apart during this time is that you start to develop separation anxiety and abandonment issues. And so I became convinced that Jen was going to leave me. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because you are so obsessed with this notion that you start to accuse the other person of the flimsiest pretexts. Just any little thing that seems off or out of place you just become convinced that it's over. And it did end, and it ended very, very badly. One day she told me that she no longer loved me and couldn't remember why she loved me, and that was absolutely devastating. And this is during a time when I was still not only struggling with my mom's loss, but physically cleaning up my mom's loss. We were going to and from my childhood home. She was the only person who still lived there, and we had to sell it, which meant that we had to clean it out, which meant that we had to gut it, which meant that we had to take all of that prized furniture of hers that she collected over the years that she thought she would will to us. But I live in New York, and my sister, she would end up going to Australia. My brother was living in Cambridge. None of us had space for antique furniture. So we had to try and sell that, and no one would buy it. So then we had to put it into a dumpster, and it wouldn't fit. So then we had to take hammers to my mom's life and smash it into tiny pieces, which was incredibly difficult. Now, I would like to say that I had enjoyed a tremendous support from the community that I was in, but the community that I was in was at a cartooning school, and it was not a place that I, for whatever reason, really fit in very well with. So when this tragedy struck, I didn't have a lot of support. I had a couple of very close friends who helped me through it, but I felt very, very much by myself. In fact, I had a very dispiriting interaction with the head of the school, James. I ran into him between the period of my mom's death and the period of her wake. I ran into him the weekend before the wake, and I know that news had reached him, but he had forgotten about what had happened. And he came up to me and just with that sort of meaningless small talk, just asked like, "Hey, doing anything fun for the weekend?" And I said, "Well, it's, my mom's wake is this weekend." And I could see the realization flicker over his face. And he stood suddenly very rigid and his face went very, very straight and drawn. And he said robotically, I'm very sorry for your loss, and then turned on his heel and just power walked away from me, just through an empty parking lot to nowhere, just to get away from the awkwardness. And it was awkward because my mom's wake was the day before Mother's Day, so that always has a fun association for me. So at this point, I'm struggling with having torn apart my mom's life and not feeling not a lot of support from the community I'm living in, and not having the woman in my life that I'd had before, and having rolling panic attacks. And I find myself in a very, very dark place where I don't like to think that I was close to doing anything to myself yet, but I was definitely having what are called suicidal ideations, where you kind of pick at the scab of your hurt and fantasize a little bit, and that gives you a weird degree of comfort. It's like playing with a loose, painful tooth. And so in a moment of desperation, I called the suicide helpline that they have in Vermont. And I got a busy signal, which I wasn't expecting. And I just started laughing and crying. And I just fell to the ground on my hands and knees. Because, universe, you've done it again. You crafty bastard. I managed to get through that night because it was just so absurd. The absurdity of it kind of drove out the darker thoughts. And I clung to that. And in about a month or two's time, two friends of mine mentioned that they were considering moving to New York City and that they needed a roommate. And this was a chance that I needed. This is a chance to leave that community, to start over again, to start fresh. And so I took it, and I moved to New York without a job, with very little money. No one else in my life other than these two people. I knew a couple of people here, but I didn't really have a large friend base in New York. And slowly I began to rebuild myself as a person. I discovered, I put myself out there doing improv, and I then discovered storytelling. And I did some therapy. I still do therapy. I did some survivors of suicide support groups. But ultimately it was the storytelling that has made the biggest difference, because it's been a chance for me to start to take these pieces and put them back together again. To go back to 1989, at Kent's house, playing with the Legos, I finally have the courage to look inside the canvas bag. And the airport Lego set it was fucking broken. He broke the shit out of it. But it wasn't irreparable. And with his begrudging help and his extra Lego pieces, we were able to patch it back together again. We were able to rebuild bits and pieces of it using, those weird leafy bits that came with the Knights Lego set, and some space bits here and there, and maybe a helicopter rotor. And the end result wasn't the same 1988 Lego airport set. It probably didn't even really look like an airport. But it was strong, and it was stable, and it was better in a lot of ways, if certainly a lot weirder. And that's the story.
That was Smithereens from Morgan Pielli. Morgan is the host of the storytelling and live therapy show Relationship with Lynn Bixenspan. He also hosts the storytelling open mic 6 Minute Saga, and he's the co-host of another storytelling podcast, When Last We Left Our Podcast. Morgan has been on Risk, Tales from the Cosmos. I haven't heard of that one, actually, and Yum's the Word. For more information about Morgan, visit him online at morganstory.com. I'm your host, Julie Threlkeld. Next week, I'll be bringing you the second set of interviews for the Tank's upcoming Story 2.0 Festival, which is coming up fast. That's in October, from the 8th through the 10th. As if on cue, there's an airplane, or it might be a train. There's something happening outside. I have been working hard on spiffing up modernstories.com a bit. You will, if you're not already subscribed to this podcast, you will find that when you go to modernstories.com to the podcast area, modernstories.com/mix, there's now a lovely new subscribe button that you can use to subscribe to the podcast in just a click or two using your favorite podcast app. It works really well on mobile, too. And I've also been working on a whole bunch of other improvements in the events area to help people who put on events and people who like to go to events find and promote these events. And as soon as I get all that stuff rigged up and working properly, I will have an announcement in the form of a post, as well as some words about these things on the next episode of the podcast or whenever it's ready. However, there's something you can do for me before then, and that is that if you enjoy this podcast, I would really appreciate it if you went to iTunes and wrote not just a review, but a good review, because it helps people find this podcast, and it's gratifying. And finally, I'd like to thank Kevin Allison, host of the Risk Live Show and Risk Podcast, for giving me a mention for the show a couple weeks ago. It has caused my listenership to, relatively speaking, explode. And I hope those of you who have discovered the show through that mention will stick around, because the stories are just getting better and better. And I'm lining up a whole bunch of people who I really love, some of whom are either new to storytelling or they've been away for a while. And either way, I'm looking forward to presenting their stories to you in this format. So, until next week, this has been Modern Stories Mix.